Today I'm joined by Mark Blyth, the co-author of Angrynomics, a book which explains the rising tide of anger in our population at large. Anger, of course, can be useful and it can also be destructive. And in the book, there's a few proposals for some radical solutions for an increasing polarised and confusing world. I really like the phrase I read on one of the reviews, which is Angrynomics is for anyone wondering where the hell do we go from here, which seems like a fantastic time to be looking at this, given that we're in the middle of a pandemic and given that we're right in the midst, as we speak, of the American elections. So over to Mark. Welcome, Mark.
Nice to be with you.
Okay.
From Rhode Island, by the way. I'm in Rhode Island, just in case anybody wants to know.
I should have said that. Rhode Island, which of course is not really an island, but we won't go there.
It's not an island. We're only an island for tax purposes.
So, Mark, when you and I first spoke, I wasn't sure about. I was expecting a Rhode Island accent, and of course, what I got back was a Dundee accent. So there you go.
Funny that.
And still there after all these years. So, Mark, just if you could, our population, our population today, our delegates who are listening, are responsible for devising services to millions of customers about all sorts of things, whether it's banking or health or insurance or whatever else it is. And of course, they meet with those populations. And I think they'd be interested, we'd all be interested just to tell us, you know, why the population at large is getting angrier. What's changed?
Well, what's changed has been changing for 30 years. So one way to think about this is who bears risk. So go back 30, 40 years ago. If you were a manual worker in Glasgow, you're probably covered by a union agreement. The union, in a sense, was shielding you from some risk. It was bargaining for your wages. You're probably covered by some other agreements that allowed you certain time off and benefits and all the rest of it. Similarly, if you were self-employed, right, you were covered by certain protections that were in the law. Progressively over time, we've removed these things. We've shifted the risk from corporates and governments more and more onto individuals. And the question is, do they have the capacity to bear those risks when the world itself becomes more and more uncertain? Now, compound this with this giant rise that we've seen across the Western world in particular in material inequality, with, by some estimates that have just come out, the American figures are absolutely astonishing. There's a new study from Rand Corporation that estimates that if you kept all the taxes, benefits, and regulations in place in 1980 and just ran the numbers up and had the same growth rates going through, then your average worker would be around $20,000 a year richer. But because of the changes that we've made, basically all of that's gone to the top 5% of the population, which by some estimates is some $55 trillion in wealth, which has been siphoned up, but has singularly failed to trickle down. And Britain is just an echo in many ways of what's happened in the US in that regard. So basically this ramping up in inequality makes people's lives more uncertain, more fragile, more vulnerable to shocks. At the same time, there's been a whole host of regulatory and legal changes, which means that they need to bear more of those shocks. So what does that do? It increases the felt uncertainty in their lives. It makes us aware of the gig economy. It gives us terms like the precariat. It gives us minimum wages as maximum wages for large sections of the population. And of course, eventually that pisses people off, because what you're doing is you're putting them in a situation where they cannot control many aspects of their own lives. Think about if you have kids and you have to deal with 0-hour contracts. Think about getting on the train with your lunch because you've been told you're coming into work and then you get a text message that says your hours have been cancelled. That's the world that we're building. And while that's kind of individually rational for firms to do it, don't expect your workers or your consumers to like it because they're on the brunt end of it.
Yeah, interesting. And in terms of today, so right now we're in the middle of this pandemic and lots of us, in fact, the industry that we're all involved in, which is people serving customers, has seen this massive transfer back to home working, if you like, something we thought we'd never see, sort of like a hockey stick curve. It was always predicted to grow, but now has grown hugely. And I know it's always been big in the States, but it was never really particularly big in the UK and in Europe. Does that in some way assuage us a bit? Does it make us more in control? What do you think? Does it give back?
In some ways it does, but I mean, in other ways it doesn't. So what we're seeing already in the tech sector in the United States is that firms based in very expensive areas like California and Colorado are saying, oh, Bill, you're doing coding for us in a basement in Rhode Island. Well, in that case, then that's great, keep doing it. But we're not paying any benefits now. You're totally an independent contractor, and we're going to cut your wages by a third because it's much cheaper there. More money for me. Right, so we're already seeing that there's a two-way effect on this one. What's not being factored in here is the labour productivity gains. So John Quiggin, who's an Australian economist, pointed this out, and I don't know how we're ever going to see this show up in the figures, but it definitely means something for corporate bottom lines. Historically, regardless of which country you live in, if you're in a sort of rich country, you spend an hour getting to work and an hour getting back. Nobody's doing that now. And from the data that we've seen so far, people are actually starting work 10 minutes early. So what that means is you're working an extra 8 to 10 hours a week that you didn't do before. So in other words, there's an extra day has popped up. This is the largest increase in labour productivity in the history of the world. And we have yet to acknowledge that it's happened. And we have yet to actually see it in the figures. So that tells you something about the way we calculate the figures. So there's definitely an upside in this. The question is, how much of the upside do the actual workers get to keep of this? And my guess is increasingly little.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. What do you think we learned from, or did we learn from 2008 crash? You know, because there was a lot of learnings went on there. A lot of organisations reshaped their thinking, trying to build more trust between organisations and consumers. Did we learn, or in your view, did we not learn?
Well, we did learn, and we learned the following, that you need to give your banks much bigger capital buffers, as they call it. In other words, you can't run with leverage ratios that are insane. That means that if you get a 2% turn against your asset base, you're suddenly insolvent. You've got to have big wedges of cash and other liquid assets. That means that if you run at a bad times, you run through this before you run to the public purse. If you notice and so far at least in the COVID pandemic, the one sector that hasn't needed a bailout has been banking. So clearly we did something right in the reboot of that sector, but what we actually did, unfortunately, was fragilize all the other sectors. And you see this particularly in the US, less so in the UK, with the phenomenon of share buybacks. So why should I bother to actually invest in plant equipment, higher wages, skills, training, when I can just I can borrow money at 0% and then issue a bond at a negative real rate if I'm a company like Apple, and then use the cash from that to buy back my own shares and effectively reap a 6% equity gain. So what we've done is we've turned our companies increasingly into financial machines, whereby the product is secondary. And the best example of this is the disaster that has become the Boeing Corporation, where they have planes that nobody wants. One of them is basically unsafe to fly, and they spent $48 billion on buybacks. So we learned stuff in banking. We totally didn't learn, and we transferred all those risks to the rest of the economy.
What can we learn from this pandemic? What can make us less angry? What do you think? What's the tips? If you were advising government, let's say you're advising the new government in the States, you're advising the government here in the UK, what would you advise?
Couple of easy lifts. One thing that really makes people angry is having no control over their working hours. So basically ban 0-hour contracts. Just right there, just done. Dead easy, one little line of legislation, over. What else could you do? Well, when you basically, your personality of the year is Marcus Rashford, because he's pointed out that since 1980, the UK economy has doubled in size and trebled in wealth, and yet you need to have 1.7 million people a day receiving school meals, then you have a serious problem with hunger and poverty. And stop calling it social exclusion or other bullshit terms. Call it what it is. You've got tons of poor people because you don't pay them enough. So figure out how you're going to pay them more. If you stabilize people's hours and pay them a bit more, they will be a lot less angry. It's not rocket science.
Yeah. And one of the features, I suppose, for the whole customer service industry has probably been quite good at that, being good at flexibility, being good at letting people work when they want, and the home working piece has been popular. So I think that there probably are some positives there. I accept that the gig economy is something quite different. Restoring trust then. So one of the lessons that this whole sector learned after 2010 was that people really needed to speak throughout the crisis, but they knew when they were communicating with somebody like them that actually they could trust them. So a lot of organisations using their frontline operators to rebuild trust. What's your thoughts on that?
I would say be aware of the fact that the people that you're talking to aren't just angry, they're feeling fragile. Right? I'm very fond of this word because I think it describes the way that we have built society. It's not robust to shocks. One single shock can send a family over the edge. whether it's into despair, whether it's into drug addiction, whether it's homelessness. There's very little in the way of financial and other cushions. So people feel tense, they feel fraught, and they increasingly feel that they don't hold any of the cards. So basically just engaging with people in such a way that recognizes that they feel fragile, that they feel vulnerable, and then making them feel in a genuine way that I'm listening. I actually get what you're talking about. I'm on your side. My job is to help you get to a better place to solve your problem. That is how to approach people in this moment. Because it's that feeling of felt uncertainty and lack of control that if you're on a call line and someone says, hi, I'll be pleased to not solve your problem. Please hold for 20 minutes while I drive you insane. That's not going to go down well.
Yeah. So you think building trust, investing in helping customers who are fragile, vulnerable, I suppose the big word is vulnerability, isn't it? Is vulnerability too, doesn't really do it for you? You think fragile is the word we should be using?
I mean, I'm not fussy, whichever one you like, right? But I mean, essentially it's pointing in the same direction. You know, this isn't sort of like happy time where everybody's really confident about the future and feels that their lives are getting better and the lives of their children are going to get better. For many people, the majority of people in the United Kingdom, when you survey them, they do not feel this way. So then, you know, if you're providing them a service and they think that service is in many cases expensive and they're cash strapped, you know, don't expect them to be grateful when they call. So the question is, how do you best interface with that? And to me, the best thing to do is humility and listening.
Your own personal side, do you like, are you somebody who likes automation? Do you like dealing with doing your own stuff, or do you like speaking to people? What's your preference?
Good question. It depends on the people. I mean, there's some people I really don't want to speak to. So I'd like to automate them as much as possible. Automation's always an augmentation, right? At the end of the day, a fully sort of cybernetic system, a fully algorithmic system is horrible. Like, nobody speaks to Siri, right? I mean, if you literally phone up Siri and have a chat, you need help, right? So all technologies are augmentation of what humans want to do. And that's the way that they should be treated. Once they become sort of standalone substitute for human interaction, you're building yourself something that's going to blow up in your face, because people do not react well to that.
That's a really good point, actually. I mean, in this whole industry, we talk about blended, we talk about automation, and we look at robotics, we look at everything to take the heavy load, to let humans be more human. I mean, that is the ultimate goal, so that, just as you say, when you speak to somebody, you're speaking to somebody who really understands what it is, and they've got the time to explore with you and take their time. And that brings me really to another issue, which is, to what extent should big corporates and brands, not even huge ones, but, you know, mainstream brands, take on the role of solving the society's ills, if you like? So if people are lonely and confused and don't have a lot of people to speak to, and maybe the only person to speak to is the driver that drops off a parcel or whatever, and then they might use some helplines, to what extent in this sort of new world that we're going into, should organisations take on that role? So it's outside of their sphere. So my job is to sell you or look after your money, to give you an insurance policy. What do you think in the future is the role also to understand social ills and help to reduce fragility?
I think it is, in terms of if you actually want your workforce to thrive, right? If you want to have a good company, it's not about, like, you know, let's when we used to have parties, have your annual big piss up party and pretend that everything else is fine, right? You essentially are managing talent. And if you're serious about the words that get used in these industries, about how all of your talent is human and you're people-centered, etc., well, that starts with the well-being of your own workforce. If they're under the cosh, if they're not feeling the love, then don't expect them to reciprocate it back. It's really straightforward. Is it the job of firms to basically tackle all society's ills? No, absolutely not. But if they basically produce healthy environments where people actually want to show up to work and do the work, then they've already done their bit. But when they renege on that, and every firm is trying to cut costs and do exactly the thing to maximize profits and care about shareholders and nothing else, then guess what? You end up with a very embittered workforce in a highly sort of polarized society, which is where we've gotten to.
Yeah, it's good. We've talked a lot, actually, at last year's convention. We heard some examples of some organisations who actually actively empower their staff to give away some freebies to people in need and in the energy market, etc., etc. And, you know, I think that there was a move, I think, at that stage, and that was last November, which seems a long, long way back, to actually address just that point. But and I think somebody at Davos last year, I can't remember who it was, somebody mentioned about, a whole new, it's no longer corporate social responsibility, it's socially responsible companies. So, is that move? And I wonder, post-pandemic, will we see a bigger move? Is that a hope, or is it a bit of a fantasy? Do you think companies will move like that, or will they be governed too much by the need to reduce costs?
Well, I mean, apart from the fact that your source came from Davos, which basically is the world's biggest bullshit factory, as far as I can figure out, it doesn't do anything apart from talk about technology that doesn't exist and how we're all going to be empowered and all this nonsense. I think the point is well taken, in that at the end of the day, what are corporations? Corporations, particularly in the American space, are legal persons. And that means that you get certain rights, but with those rights come responsibilities. And if you think that your responsibility, like most corporations in the US, is to pay as little tax as possible and to use tax optimization as one of your main profit vehicles, and then to basically financialize the inside of your company so that you become incredibly fragile to shocks. So when there's a pandemic, you need a bailout from the taxpayer. You're not doing the right thing, and you know it. You may be enriching the C-suite, but you can keep that going for a while. But eventually that little party is going to crash. So if you want to be a responsible corporation, never mind socially responsible, you got to look after more than the bottom line. You got to look after your talent, and you got to think about what is your contribution to the wider society.
Yeah, interesting. What about your thoughts about sort of future then, in terms of the kind of service that people should be offered? I mean, do you think it is that for those who are able? I mean, digital technology is amazing. We all know that. But in the future, there is predicted to be so much more done in an automated way and so much less done human to human. What's your thoughts on that? Could that work? What would be the factors that would make it work? Or do you think that's just something that's just never going to work?
I think a lot of that is Silicon Valley talking their book to bid up their share price with products they haven't invented yet, to be perfectly honest. The fastest growing job in the United States, and has been for 10 years, is elder care nurse. The Japanese tried to invent a robot for that. It didn't work, and they hate everyone else. So, if it was going to work anywhere, it would have worked there. So your next fastest growing job is short order cook. I guess you can automate that. The one that's really going to get automated, which I think is pretty hilarious, is computer programmer. Because what AI and machine learning enables software to do is to replicate software. So all these people who are sending their kids now to coding camp and destroying their summers and any athletic prowess they may develop as a teenager. Thanks, because the skill they're learning is going to be pretty much redundant in 10 years. So yeah, there's going to be massive changes, but not in the sectors that we think. Most of what we do now is we don't make things for each other. We swap services with each other. And those services are literally, in many cases, touch. You don't touch with a robot. You don't touch with an algorithm.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I mean, there's this saying, I don't know whether you agree with it, that we don't even know what jobs will exist. So most of the jobs that exist, a lot of the new jobs today, we didn't know about in 10 years' time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. If you just said web programmer in 1985, nobody would, what are you talking about? That, of course, 1/3 of all jobs basically change by some estimates every 12 years. So that's absolutely the case. But here's something else that's absolutely the case. All of our societies are getting older, right? And Alzheimer and Parkinson's are becoming chronic diseases, which we have no treatments for that are effective. So you're going to have an awful lot of people looking after an awful lot of old people who can't look after themselves. I'm sure there are some technological augmentations you can do for that, but when 20% of your budget's going to be spent on that, it's going to be a lot of moving people around beds.
Yeah. And in terms of another big piece that's been talked about, and we talked about through our conference and through our various sessions, this whole notion that if everybody's working at home, and predicted to be for quite some time, regardless of the great news about vaccines that's coming along, let's just assume that a lot of people will continue home working because it works for them. It does it. Does that therefore mean that companies can and will globally source, and actually you won't need so many people round about your organisation, or location won't be a factor? Will we see more of that? And what do you think is in reality, or is it rhetoric at the moment?
Well, there's certainly some signs of this, and some industries have been doing this for years. I mean, the back office of Wall Street is effectively run out of large parts of India. Right? So in a sense, there's nothing new in that. That's been going on for quite some time. The question is, what are the limits? What are the limits to doing this, right? So let's think about the United States just now. You have half the country that is furious with foreigners, amongst other things, and hates racial difference, and effectively sort of is doubling down on a kind of white nostalgia. If you give them a call center in a foreign country, how do you think they're going to react? Right? So, you know, maybe there are limits. Let's say that you run a firm and you're going to, well, I can get a lot of people who are a lot cheaper to do this somewhere else. So you outsource to Romania, very good for computers, right? Very, very good skilled workers, fraction of the price. But then you've got these kind of supply chain issues, if you will, digital supply chains. You've got time zone issues. You don't actually know any of the workers. You never hired them. You're doing the whole thing on a contract. What happens if basically they're running what con artists call a long firm, right? So basically you take the book, they come in, they give you the work's amazing, it's half the price, you double it, you give them more, they do it again, you double it again, do it again, and boom, then they just disappear. What's your recourse? How are you going to find them? How are you going to find the 7 million you just shipped them? Right? There's a reason that we keep things close to home, because we can monitor them. So there's reward, but there's also risk. There's nothing new in that.
Yeah. No, we've seen a lot of global outsourcing over the last 10 years, absolutely. But we're now also seeing a bit of protectionism, probably a little bit due to borders shutting around pandemics. So if we make the assumption that perhaps this virus may, you know, looking at half empty, might have other viruses, in a funny way, technology's made the world smaller, but the pandemic has made it bigger again. Is that something you'd agree with, or?
Well, I think about it this way. Think about China's reaction. So China's basically been getting dumped on by the US here in the Trump administration. It's done a bunch of stuff that hasn't helped itself in terms of its image internationally. And it has built a giant firewall of connectivity to keep things out, not to integrate. So you can use these technologies to separate as well as to connect. The assumption, the kind of like the Davos assumption, if you will, that like we're all connected and we're all on a level playing field and it's changed everything, has always been bullshit. And I think we're beginning to see this now, that basically the recognition is that if a huge part of my profits come from particular intellectual property rights, and I know that there are foreign agents or foreign firms out there trying to steal my IPR, which basically means my profit model can disappear overnight, then I'm going to be very, very protective about my tech. I'm not going to be putting that out there for people to find, and I'm going to want high-scale protections for doing that. So with that coming together comes a necessary coming apart.
Okay, so in this new world then, when people are busy homeworking, do they need management?
That's a really great question. And it kind of builds on the last thing we were talking about. So imagine that you've decided that you've got your local firm and people are working from home and they're all doing great. And they actually have these horizontal connections whereby they start talking to each other through Zoom and they basically bypass the management function and they get their stuff done. There's a big question of redundancy. But let's say that you take that and you go, right, what we're going to do is we're going to dump that all in Romania or Estonia or whatever it is, right? Then you need management because you're going to have to monitor all those people that you don't know. So what happens is I think the management gets reconfigured, right? It's not as if it disappears as a function. It's just that you're going to discover a lot of things that you thought you needed to be on top of, you really don't, which actually then frees you up to really take care of other things that you need to take care of because the world has changed. But what it also shows is that seniority is no predictor of security, right? You can find yourself redundant because your underlings figure out how to do stuff without you. There's a very famous case of this back in 1974. Volvo had a plant in Sweden. I think it was called Uddevalla or something like this. And they basically organized the workers into teams. And they basically took out the production line and said, just do teams, like just figure out how to build a car and do it your way. And it did. It worked. I mean, was it as efficient as the line? No, but it did work. And of course, what this did was freak management out because it basically said, hell, I get paid a lot of money for supervising these guys. What if they don't need supervision? Well, you know, that's still an open question.
Yeah, big one for, I think, organisations throughout every sector, actually, just about the role. And of course,
well, think about it. If you're coming out of a pandemic, you've burned through a ton of cash. You've got a recovery. It's a good recovery, and you've got an opportunity to rebuild, right? Do you do what we usually do, which is throw the cheapest worker under the bus and try and automate, or does that hit a wall? Or do you basically look at your below C-suite to C-suite level and say, who are we paying a ton of money to, and what do they actually do?
Yeah, interesting thoughts. And of course, perhaps one of the conversation points is the role of management maybe is not so much about visual, you know, walking the floor, about spreadsheets, about telling people what to do. Maybe it needs to be more about well-being. It needs to be more about coaching. It needs to be more about adding value to that person, taking away a bit of the load. And I think that's certainly some of the pluses in our sector we're seeing just now. In fact, that to be honest with you, that was happening before pandemic. People realised this role of first-line manager is about support, because there's so many in this whole world. People dealing with customers often are the most skilled people in an organisation, but they never really get that recognition. They're now getting that recognition. So I think there's
you see this very much in financial firms. Financial firms are, of course, filled with quants. Quants come from engineering backgrounds. Engineers are notorious for being bad people. So when they get put into management, they're terrible at it, and basically they make everyone angry and annoyed. Really good people tend not to have those skills. So they don't get promoted into those positions because they haven't come up the hard way in that sense. And a lot of what management education does is essentially deprogram engineers and turn them into humans. So if you can start off with humans, you save yourself a step.
I'm sure our audience are going to love that.
But I'm sure there's an engineer in your audience going,
it may well be. They pop up everywhere, or accountants, or whoever. Mark, we could talk all day on this book. I just want to leave you with. I want to leave the audience with a few. Why should they read it? What are they going to learn from the book, from Angrynomics? What will it help them understand? Do you think, if you're trying to reshape things?
It's everything. All right. No, Eric and I sat down and decided we were going to write a book that was for normal people, because we've both written enough book for specialists in academics. And we recorded the book. We did it as a dialogue. The book is actually written as a dialogue. And we took it and we turned it into normal text and read it. And it was horrible, because it just sounded exactly what it was, which was like two superannuated 50-year-old white guys setting the world to rights. So we put it back into a dialogue and made it basically about disagreement, about the origins of populism and why economics doesn't work and why big economic crashes produce anger and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, it's a rip-roaring good read. Basically, give me 3 hours, sit on a plane when we get to fly again, and then read it. You can get through the whole thing in 3 hours, and you'll learn a ton of stuff. So I think you should do that.
Yeah, fantastic. And we'll be certainly promoting and making it available to those who wish. So anyway, I'd like to say thanks to Mark, and hopefully we can chat again soon, and hopefully the world will become less angry. And
and hopefully next time we will do this face-to-face. And I can hold a copy of my Angrynomics book and ask how many of you bought this, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Mark. Cheers.
Bye-bye.